Thank you. Our speaker today received his bachelor's degree from Brooklyn College and his PhD from Princeton University in 1955. He's been awarded a number of honors, including Phi Beta Kappa and visiting lectureships. He taught at Michigan State University. He was also a member of the faculty for 2 years at Harvard, or 1 year at Harvard University, and since 1968 he's been a professor at State University of New York in Albany. He's written at least 25 books and numerous journal articles. I came back to Huntsville today primarily to introduce Dr. Toch. About 2 decades ago, the State Bar of Indiana convened a meeting of practitioners and theorists in criminal justice. And among the people attending that meeting was Dr. Toch, where I met him for the first time, and was impressed with his mind as well as certain other idiosyncrasies that he has. Then, shortly thereafter, we again met and spent some time together at the Beto Institute on the campus of the University of Ohio in Columbus. And I was further impressed with his mind. And shortly thereafter, I brought him, and when I was interim director, I brought him and Ernst Vandenhaeg down for one of the interagency workshops where they appeared together on a panel to the edification and enlightenment of all that were present. I'm pleased that he's here. Now, he has one weakness, or an erroneous thought that he holds. He labors under the wholly false impression that Jean Harris, the woman that killed the Scarsdale Diet Man, for which she ought to have gotten a medal, he thinks that she's a spoiled brat and that the governor of New York is right in not commuting her sentence. And I hope that he lives long enough that his mind is disabused of that thought. But it's a great privilege for me today to introduce my friend, a man whose mind for whose mind I have the highest respect, Dr. Hans Toch.
Let me say that I would not be here if this lecture were not named after George Beto. And since Dr. Beto brought it up, let me confess that the idiosyncrasy he's referring to is that in that meeting in Indiana, they threw me out of the place because of my cigar smoking. And there are some memories you try to repress. After last week's Senate hearings, I endorsed the definition of politics in Webster's that reads, quote, political activities characterized by artful and often dishonest practices, end of quote. But that is the sort of politics with a capital P that I shall try not to discuss here today. However, before I don't talk about politics, let me point out that there are 2 types of violence-related politics that I won't talk about. The first has to do with what goes on inside a small circle, in this case the ivy-covered world of violence research and academia, present company accepted. And the rule here is that if you are in an out-group, you see the in-group as engaged in Machiavellian machinations. That is, it becomes easy to deal with rejection once you conclude that the process of rejecting is tainted. If someone gets funds that you covet, it's nice to know that the review process has been wired and that the award is a charade, because it might otherwise be possible that a proposal could be turned down based on a dispassionate assessment of its merits. And the larger version of the game is similar in that those of us who like to eat in cafeterias and become just to take as an example, those of us who like to eat in cafeterias and become advocates of gun control, I hope you're not going to revoke my Texas citizenship, almost invariably insist that opponents of gun control are subsidized stooges of the National Rifle Association. That is, according to this kind of view, no one who holds an opposing position has integrity. No one has arrived at his or her beliefs through the use of logic or by looking at evidence. Now, the process I want to talk about is related, but has to do with another of Webster's definitions, which is, quote, the political opinions and sympathies of a person. And the opinions and sympathies that are at issue are those that an out-group says that the in-group has and the in-group denies. In fact, in some of these instances that I'm going to refer to, the in-group insists that the out-group is not an out-group. And that is what I mean by political correctness. That is the charge that says that things should be controversial, the things that should be controversial become non-controversial, and that they are held to be engraved in stone. That we don't look for the context that molds consensus in our field at a particular time. In other words, we think that this time there is such a thing as a verity, even if beliefs have always been context relevant in more primitive days, such as those in which we knew that the earth was flat or its social science equivalent. Now let me stop rambling in general terms, which is a privilege of senile old folks like me, and start by capitalizing on the one advantage of age, which is that if you lived long enough, you can see fashions shift in your lifetime. In the days of the Violence Commission, that is the 60s, when I was a nominal consultant to that august body, sociology was in the ascendance in the field. That is, the dominant view of violence causation was the subculture violence perspective, and the commission staff were all card-carrying subculturists. Now today, if you pay attention to what goes on, individual differences, genes, heritability have become fashionable. The science pages of newspapers are full of articles that trace everything from hangnails to grouchiness to a person's genes. Eminent sociologists who used to talk about subculture now talk fondly of biogenetics and birth defects, and when you try to talk to them about subcultures, they look bored. Now, in the eminent sociologists' defense, some of them were always ecumenical. My friend Marvin Wolfgang, for instance, wrote a seminal book with Ferracuti, who was a psychiatrist, and the book was subtitled Toward an Interdisciplinary Theory of Violence. And the portion that preceded the statement of the theory was a commendably ecumenically annotated bibliography that covered a very wide and largely irrelevant interdisciplinary spectrum. The Violence Commission similarly collected working papers from a large variety of perspectives. Like the spaghetti commercial, they could say it's all in there, and it was. Now, as a matter of fact, you can pretty much depend that present and future conclaves of experts will inevitably do the same thing in order not to offend any tenured or live colleagues. And they will say you must consider all of this if you want to understand the subject. But you can't consider all of it, of course, because an explanation is not a spaghetti sauce, and there is no way of integrating laundry lists into coherent constructs. So if you're in the social science business, You have to be true unto your own perspective, and you must say to yourself, I find these studies to be the most relevant to my concerns, and all these constructs to be the most useful. There is no other way unless you're a genius with a penchant for integrative thinking. The Violence Commission staff, I'm sorry to say, were not geniuses, so they chose subcultural theory, which was fashionable at the time. Today, non-geniuses listen to different drummers because different drummers are fashionable. Genes are fashionable. In the words of Thomas Zass, who is a friend of mine, it has become fashionable to, quote, look for a twisted molecule behind every twisted thought, unquote. But genes are not defended on the grounds that they help us to understand why felons engage in felonious employment or spouses throw dishes at each other. Instead, they are offered as a testimonial to our newfound open-mindedness. Wiener and Wolfgang tell us, for instance, that biological explanations have been periodically rejected by sociologists as deterministic, as implying a set of organic factors which exclusively drive or control the onset and course of violent behavior. At present, however, we want to italicize this, a more moderate and reasonable position prevails. Biological and sociological as well as other non-organic and environmental factors are thought to interact with one another to make violent behavior more or less likely to occur. But this does not mean that the ecumenical age has arrived. Several pages later, Wiener and Wolfgang, that's the same Wolfgang, by the way, conclude that perhaps what is most striking about the results of these efforts, talking about all of the studies that have been done in this biological tradition, is the relative lack of interdisciplinary and integrative approaches. Theories and findings within and across disciplines tend to be disconnected. Now, one reason the findings are disconnected is because some people are not as ecumenical as we are. That is, some explanations are deterministic. They do assume that twisted molecules produce twisted thoughts. Gottfriedson and Hershey, you remember Gottfriedson, have reminded us that a major tenet, and I'm quoting, of positivism is the view that acts have causes. All too frequently, the idea that acts have causes is translated via the research literature into the idea that specific effects have specific causes. For biological positivism, this leads to the search for a genetic component to account for variations in specific acts. In summarizing brain damage research claims, for instance, the New York Times reports, quote, the research may also offer insights into some criminal violence. 2 studies involving a total of 29 murderers on death row in at least 4 states found that almost all had a serious brain injury that may have triggered their violence, end of quote. So-called integrative efforts can be downright non-integrating. Consider the following example. Quote, exactly how a man's high testosterone level is expressed depends in part on his social class, another new study has found. For men of lower social and economic status, it is likely to show up as a readiness for fights, a history of minor crimes, and chronic trouble with parents. Chronic trouble with parents, teachers, and peers. But that is not true at higher social and economic ranks, where the display of dominance is more subdued, researchers say. In other words, biology leads to violence among poor people, but is tempered by civilization among the rich. The rich are less subject to determinism. It is a matter of probability. Chances of predestination increase as biological stigmata accumulate, which they do, coincidentally, among the disadvantaged. The line sounds familiar. It marks the return of the bride of the son of Lombroso. It is a tradition of research that, according to Gottfriedson and Hershey, quote, has produced a set of findings such as physiognomy, feeble-mindedness, XYY, inheritance of criminality, that survived only so long as was necessary to subject them to replication or to straightforward critical analysis. A renewed search for discredited differences makes a fascinating quest. Now, I want to put that aside for a few pages and turn to a second fascinating subject, which is that of activist researchers who tend to caricature the violence problem, and particularly the domestic violence problem. As you know, the academic business comprises a set of enterprises which prizes science but has a stake in certain outcomes. An example with which you're all familiar is that of parapsychology researchers. They are committed to dispassionate inquiry, but they would be devastated to discover that there are no disembodied substances that hover in laboratories and spend their time reading playing cards. Parapsychologists no doubt go to their graves expecting to return to haunt the laboratories of their successors or whatever they think they will haunt. Their activity is science, but the substratum is faith, which results in an uncritical acceptance of data that are congruent with it. However, there is a catch. Parapsychology researchers are surrounded by colleagues who sneer at what they do and look over their shoulders. Parapsychology research is not politically correct. Quite the contrary. It is, if anything, politically incorrect. Violence research advocacy groups are invariably politically correct. They are not surrounded by in-groups that question their data and critique their methods. They are surrounded by other in-groups that believe in symbiotic cohabitation. Their point being, if we listen politely to each other's contentions, maybe others, such as policymakers, will listen respectfully to us all. Two major sets of violence researcher advocates are the child savers and the syndrome disseminators. The domain of child savers is the physical and sexual abuse of children. Syndrome disseminators are persons who disseminate syndromes in domains that are of interest to them. They postulate standard victimization experiences that evolve in set sequences over time. In fact, you'll be interested to know there is now an Anita Hill syndrome. The New York Times talking last week about some lobbying groups who, quote, blamed the Democrats for not allowing the testimony of sexual harassment experts who might have been able to explain to skeptical senators why victims of sexual harassment might behave as Professor Hill said she did, following Judge Thomas to take a better job she wanted, and then maintaining a, quote, cordial but distant relationship with him to avoid burning her bridges. In other words, this is now a new syndrome. Instead of avoiding the person who is victimized, you're so ambitious that you follow them around. Now, syndromes among offenders, of course, redefine these offenders as victims. I don't know whether you saw the segment of 2020 on September the 17th, which dealt with the problem of battered women. In one of the segments, they had a group of 25 ladies at the California Institute for Women at Frontera, all of whom were convicted of killing their spouses, and they were unanimous in concluding that they were all victims of the battered spouse syndrome. Now, that is an application of syndrome thinking to offenders, which then converts them into victims, not your favorite female offenders. Child and syndrome advocates are not mutually exclusive, of course, because children can have syndromes. One syndrome that is applied to children is the post-traumatic stress syndrome, which started life as a shorthand summary of the lingering after effects of wartime experiences among traumatized combatants. Another is the child sexual abuse victimization syndrome. This syndrome can be a problem for legal fact-finding because one symptom is that victims retract claims of abuse. In other words, if a child insists that it was never harmed, you are invited to conclude that the child has in fact been abused. In their role as scientists, researcher advocates are particularly wedded to methods of inquiry that are designed to encourage the recall of types of victimization experiences that are of interest to them. The data typically document the extensive prevalence of the experiences in question. The researcher advocates are not interested in the application of their methodology to competing victimization experiences, such as spousal violence that features assaults on husbands by wives. They are also not interested in research that focuses on victim-offender transaction, such as chronic spousal conflict that is less than one-sided, or antisocial, rebellious, or oppositional behavior by children who are punitively dealt with by parents. In other words, their point is not to gain an understanding of violent transactions, but to highlight specific contributions by specific participants to these transactions. This fact is not a coincidence. Research advocacy has filled a vacuum, calling attention to needs that had been neglected until research advocates called attention to them. The researcher advocate had to storm the citadel, shouting, "Behold the battered child. Look at the X-ray, the broken bones. There are many, many battered children, and we have been ignoring them. Look," they'd say, "a spouse terrorized into violent submission. Many others like her exist, living in despair. Some explode in panic and kill their tormentors." But how many such victims were there, and how serious was their need? As a problem advocate, you had to feel that the need was terribly serious. And the closer you looked, the more victims you saw, particularly when the wording of questions you asked about victimization were plaintive, generous, and inviting. Soon, some researcher advocates' world was populated by an amazingly heavy prevalence of their favorite type of aggressors engaged in aggressing against the type of victim on whose behalf they wished to mobilize concern. Here was a world completely populated by men predisposed to child molestation and women who did their unfortunate best to forget experiences of prepubescent rape. The same point applies this week to sexual harassment. The surprising aspect of the situation was that this jaundiced view of our supposedly civilized society and the unflattering conception of human nature that it implies seemed to sell to the public. No one likes child molesters, of course, and sexual victimization is an unconscionable evil. But we also live in a world in which we know our own choices of sexual partners and those of our friends. On the face of it, one would think that legislators or newspaper readers or undergraduates would express surprise when informed that the predilection for young children as sex objects is endemic in this country. The absence of incredulity suggests either, first, that we expect inflated numbers from researcher advocates and assume that the numbers are irrelevant in assessing the seriousness of the problem, of any problem. Two, that we think of ourselves as belonging to a civilized elite surrounded by a horde of animalistic primitives. Or three, that we relegate the reports of the researchers to the realm of human interest stories which titillate whether they are true or not. To make an issue of the implausibility of the accounts would also produce unnecessary conflict with people who feel strongly about what they say and who are humane and decent people intent on reducing human suffering. To quibble would put us on the side of disgusting child molesters or other depraved people. And what does it matter anyway whether there are a few thousand monsters or half the male population? It does not matter, of course, except to the person falsely accused of child molestation. It should also matter to the entire male gender, which is indicted in some accounts with uncontradicted impunity in a reborn war of the sexes. Given that non-controvertible statement, let me turn to violence participants and to the question of how to be a politically correct research subject. In an article in a New York publication directed at state legislators, a researcher reported with a straight face that, quote, nearly 3/4 of alcoholic women suffered some type of sexual abuse during childhood, compared with 40% of the general population, end quote. An agency executive commented favorably on this report and said that, quote, the study underscores the need for early programs to help detect and respond to problems at home, end quote. The lady runs such programs, so this is clearly a matter of arguing for an expanded budget. This would all be so if the information was trustworthy, and if almost all alcoholic women had been victims of sexual abuse in childhood, we would be close to holding the key to the problems of alcoholism. Not coincidentally, female addicts would have no further need to hide bottles all over their house or to feel defensive about going on binges, and no one would question their infantile outlooks on life, nor their self-destructive patterns of conduct, nor their impact on their own families, including their babies born with alcohol syndromes. But the study has wider benefit and allows 4 out of 10 women to blame anything they like on victimization in childhood. The figure 40%, in fact, is even more impressive than the 27% estimate of female child sexual abuse victimization reported by Finkelhauer and his associates. Finkelhauer and his colleagues obtained the statistics by relying on questions that defined childhood as extending through age 18. Finkelhauer and his colleagues also asked questions like, quote, when you were a child, can you remember having any experience you would now consider sexual abuse involving someone taking nude photographs of you, or someone exhibiting parts of their body to you, or someone performing some sex act in your presence, or anything like that? Question mark. This monstrosity and others like it violate every rule of question wording and make it impossible to interpret the answers one gets. Not only are activities that range in turpitude lumped together, but the phrase anything like that adds possibilities that stagger the imagination. Moreover, there are startling ambiguities in phrases such as, quote, exhibiting parts of the body. Unquote. Does flexing muscles qualify? And are baby pictures, quote, nude photographs, unquote? Of course, none of these issues may matter, since respondents define what they, quote, now consider sexual abuse, unquote, themselves. The wording of enticing questions that elicit reports of child sexual abuse is transparently an art, but so is the answering of them. Most of the respondents who define themselves as victims of child abuse in Finkelhauer's survey said that they had unhappy childhoods. Having an unhappy childhood has become fashionable, and so is discussing your unhappy childhood with a voice on the telephone. Kinsey Institute researchers had to jump through incredible hoops to learn of experiences that are nowadays increasingly shared with strangers who matter-of-factly inquire whether you were indecently fondled as a child or if your father was a pervert. But inquiries need not be matter-of-fact. Often great pains are taken to select and train interviewers who will skillfully pursue, quote, disclosures, unquote, a term that is used to refer to claims of victimization. The absence of claims of abuse are presumably, quote, non-disclosures, unquote, and researchers feel that they reflect stubborn defensiveness in interviews. The respondents in surveys are often assured that victimization experiences are common, and they are bombarded with soothing euphemisms. This approach works, particularly in the West Coast, where 1 out of 5, 19% of women, quote, disclose, unquote, that they have been incestuously abused. In other words, we are talking about 1 out of 5 women who have experienced forcible incest in childhood. And over half, 54%, quote, disclose, unquote, that they have been sexually abused as children. 54% of the female population of San Francisco have been sexually abused as children. The author of these figures, Diana Russell, proclaims that they are underestimates of prevalence. Now, if these are underestimates, imagine what the correct estimates would be. Unhappy childhoods among offenders have been politically correct since the advent of Sigmund Freud and the profession of social work. Offenders discovered that there were researchers and sympathetic staff persons who resonated to accounts of broken homes, deprived upbringings, and early traumas. One of my own research teams included an anthropologist whom I fired, who asked inmates whether they had wanted to sleep with their mothers, which was not part of our interview schedule. Such practices have mercifully died out, but female offenders especially know that they are expected to have been sexually abused and are delivering the goods with alacrity. In New York's prison for women, the prison you were talking about, the warden quotes an expert who visited the institution and set the proportion of abused women in her population at 95%. The advantage to the inmates of confirming this hypothesis is obvious. Predatory aggressors have evolved party lines, but of a different sort. The notion of career offenders is documented, or partly documented, by accounts of ad seriatim exploits by incarcerated offenders. Not only were the offenders not shy, but they offered hair-raising statistics about their careers of pillage and mayhem. The facts that they claimed in their retrospectives no doubt impressed the interviewers and the superiors of the interviewers in Santa Monica. They must have similarly impressed less experienced inmates, giving them giants and super criminals to look up to and emulate. I suggest that there are two different types of politically correct narratives by research subjects. One is the self-exculpatory version sociologists refer to as accounts. According to sociologists, you will pardon the jargon, quote, an account is a linguistic device employed whenever an action is subjected to valuative inquiry, a statement made by a social actor to explain unanticipated or untoward behavior, unquote. Sociologists distinguish between two sorts of accounts, justifications and excuses. These are in turn defined in jargon, which I will spare you. But the words are English, that is, justifications and excuses, and their import is obvious. We are supposed to end up feeling that what a person has done is not as bad as it looked, or that what he or she did is understandable and sort of excusable given the reasons for his or her doing it. The second type of party line is what I call war stories. War stories are savored. They are told with pride and nostalgia to appreciative audiences. War stories are exchanged in locker rooms and taverns. They remind listeners of the excitement of action and the smell of gunpowder. Them were the days, my boys, flavor, derives from the contrast between the then and the now, the experience of violence participation and the drabness of most of our lives. It also has to do with assumptions about the worthiness of victories that one has won. One does not tell war stories about raiding Pearl Harbor or attacking My Lai. Los Angeles police officers are not tempted, as in the past, to tell funny anecdotes over the computerized airwaves. Dedicated delinquents can tell war stories to each other to show how tough they are. Toughness is politically correct among delinquents. It is not politically correct among most students of delinquency. These non-tough students use the term, quote, subculture, unquote, to suggest that the values of the delinquents are not congenial to them. The term has been used to describe police officers and prison guards as well as offenders. Social scientists are not good at penetrating subcultures. They are not good at talking to aggressors about aggression. One may joke in the abstract about the question, when was the last time you beat your wife? But the joke is not funny to students of violence. It is questions of this kind that they want aggressors, such as husbands, to answer. They don't want to hear about acrimony, bitterness, and marital travail, escalating fights, ending in screeching and shouting and pushing and shoving. Pushing and shoving. What they want to hear is something like, quote, "I regularly come home and beat my wife in support of male supremacy in patriarchal households," unquote. Since aggressors don't talk like that, many students of violence prefer to deal with self-defined victims or aggrieved parties in conflicts. The ideal place to do correct violence research is in shelters for battered wives. Alternately, one can do research by compiling one's experiences as an expert witness in trials involving child victimization or spousal homicide. One can do surveys, as I indicated, but this requires delicacy and considerable skill. One must know who to talk to, in whose presence or absence to do interviews, and what enticing questions to ask. And one must know how to construct indices that combine variegated aggressive behavior so that one can provide an inflated impression of prevalence. A child abuse scale, for example, must contain items such as, quote, "the respondent shamefully confessed to having spanked a child," unquote, and, quote, "the respondents did not let their teenager have the keys to the car," unquote. Child abuse research with children is especially difficult. With resistant subjects, it is a recondite art. Researchers must be trained to elicit confessions through seductive interrogatories using sexually explicit dolls. These so-called anatomical dolls are squat, frumpy, and unendearing lumps of plastic, and they have prominent pudenda surrounded by wiry hair and a plethora of orifices. Getting children to talk dirty is not a matter of luck. It is 1/10 hard work and 9/10 Yankee ingenuity. But now that I have offended half of you, let me return to my first question relating to violence theories, to violence theorists who apply a trade of their own. Most of these violence theorists are not concerned with rescuing children or fighting oppression or other causes. They are interested in violence causation and in explanations of violence. And to me, the puzzling and fascinating question is, why are certain reductionist perspectives, which sounded anachronistic a year or two back, and particularly biomedical perspectives, being resuscitated at this time? Several reasons come to mind. First, we have discovered that violent people are innately different from the rest of us. Two, the perspective is or sounds scientific, which confers solid respectability to the violence enterprise and links it to other solid scientific enterprises. Three, new sources of computerized data can be merged with existing data for a more comprehensive picture of violence than was available in the past, even if no one knows how to put it together. Four, disillusionment with subcultural explanations has led us to look in directions that are different or contrasting directions, and this was the furthest we could get. Five, criminologists need to be hard-nosed in response to critics who have attacked them for being naive, utopian, bleeding hearts who have nothing to contribute to solving the crime problem. Now, it's obvious that the last of these hypotheses is the one that I like, or I wouldn't have put it last. It also appeals to my sense of the ironic, because it suggests that experts have cut off their noses to spite their faces. Genetics or biology are hard-nosed about differences they see as built in. This pessimistic view cannot help crime fighting, which is ostensibly our goal. That is, it staggers the imagination to think of what one would do to fight crime with this perspective. The next generation of critics will surely raise this fact, as did the generation of critics who buried early positivism. Once this occurs once again and the pendulum swings again, as it must, prevailing views are bound to lose the popularity they now enjoy. Now, a second aspect that is ironic is to see pure science lurching to the right as applied science marches to the left. This disjuncture offers us two versions of political correctness, which include very different approaches to the collection and interpretation of data. I could illustrate these further, but I think the sampling I've given you makes the point. The twain won't meet, and I see no way of bridging the gap in the near future. I'm talking about the gap between what is now pure science in the violence business and applied science. As for the long term, the extremity of prevailing perspectives augurs their evanescence. One cannot keep accentuating variables that in practice do not matter, or caricaturing violence scenarios. The problems of victimization are too serious and too urgent and too complex to permit such incestuous games. Yawning gaps between reality and perspective can create pressure to close these gaps. Scientists are pressed to take time out from looking at birth defects in Denmark to consider shootings in Texas. Activists are invited to consider disaggregated or mundane complexity in conflicts, including family conflicts, and competing claims to empathy. Reviews of real incidents or contacts with real aggressors can amend parochial or stereotype preconceptions. With new insights, new views can become fashionable. Even old views can gain new life. I plan to personally capitalize on this fact. I shall return to Huntsville in 20 years or so and talk about the resurgence of subcultural theory. I trust you will be here to congratulate me on my omniscience. And I thank you, and I'm open to questions or comments.
Most of you know that Professor Toch and I were colleagues for the last 9 years on the faculty at Albany. And I've been trying to tell him during that 9-year period that he needs to be more assertive in articulating his views. But he's far too
I'm too shy. Meek
about those views. And I also know him as a person who is willing to defend those views, even if we have to stay here all night. He'll defend those views. So anybody that has any reactions or questions or suggestions?
Just a question. When you were cataloging these hypotheses, if I remember correctly, one of them was that violent people, abusive people are innately different from others. You want to elaborate on that? I'm not asking you to endorse it or condemn it, just to discuss it.
Yeah, well, of course, if one talks about people who drive trucks into cafeterias and mow down people, it is tempting not to dichotomize the world in this way. But in terms of the more routine range of violent offenders or violent disputants that you and I and the rest of us are familiar with, it seems to me that the assumption that people who are involved in these incidents or relationships are qualitatively different from the rest of us is not particularly plausible, but it is that kind of worldview that these sort of biogenetic theories lead to. That is, you know, if you carry a gene that makes you explode in situations that I can handle with equanimity, the problem of why are you involved in violence and why I am not involved in violence becomes deceptively oversimplified. And I think that's where some of this is heading. It's sort of magic solutions.
Well, you know, in a discussion I had once with Mr. Salmon, Dr. Salmon, when he was down here, I just read his books, years ago, was his book on the criminal mind.
Yeah.
And I spoke favorably of the books and told him that the only difference that I had with him was in the title. It should have been titled The Human Mind rather than The Criminal Mind, because the difference between Mr. Salmon, myself, and my colleagues and the people they chronicled in that book was one of degree, not of kind. We weren't basically different. Some of us did a little better job of controlling ourselves.
Let me say, incidentally, that the short-lived popularity of that multi-volume opus is one of these strange mysteries. Nowadays, no one has heard of it. But the Johansson and Samanoff essentially had a variation of what in clinical diagnosis is nowadays referred to as the antisocial personality disturbance. And used to be called psychopathic personality, moral imbecility, all kinds of other things. Now, in fact, the issue of what's sort of common humanity and what's qualitatively different is neatly illustrated by this. Because if you take the diagnostic criteria that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association lists for antisocial personality disturbance, which, as I say, corresponds almost precisely to what Johansson and Samanoff were talking about. And you are working in a prison. It is the rare inmate who comes into your office who does not qualify for that diagnosis. Since it is non-discriminatory or non-discriminating, it is obviously useless. And the fact of the matter is that many of these kinds of characterizations are really ways of differentiating that part of the offender spectrum that we find particularly uncongenial from the rest of the offender spectrum, and drawing some kind of sharp line. Saying, you know, most of these folks are admittedly crummy, but these guys are crummier. You know, they're absolutely disgusting. I don't want anything to do with this person. And that then becomes an artificial line that you make sound scientific, although what it really is an expression of disgust. Now, with all respect to young Johansson and the late Dr. Samanoff. Thank you. Anybody? Surely some of you must be acutely disturbed by the unfair things that I've said. Thank you.